talking about the motion "This House regrets the rise of citizen journalism in democratic nations." I've included the info slide because, as you may or may not know, whenever you're debating and there's an info slide included, the general assumption is that all the stuff in the info slide is considered as fact for the purposes of the debate, which means, just as a note that's, I guess, tangentially related to this, it's always important to not question the info slide and at the same time to just use it to help you along. So in this case, for instance, citizen journalism has been defined a certain way, so it would be good and important for the debate to be operating within these perimeters in order to ensure, I guess, a robust debate instead of one that kind of dabbles in what exactly citizen journalism is. But of course, you can still further define citizen journalism and clarify what it includes or doesn't include. Like that's not something that gets excluded as a result of the info slide. Just remember that it has to be consistent with what is included. So the motion includes two examples here, Stomp and TikTok. And I think that also kind of hints at what exactly this motion is about, because Stomp, as you may or may not know, is a subsidiary, I guess, branch or segment of the Straits Times, and TikTok is well, social media platform. So the important thing about this is that it includes not just platforms where people can independently publish things, but also platforms that might be subsumed under corporate media outlets. Yeah. So let's get into this. First and foremost, I think it's important to note that this debate is a regrets motion. And just like any regrets motion or supports motion, it's a retrospective debate, meaning that the rise has already been assumed to happen, this rise of citizen journalism in democratic nations. We assume that it's already happened, so the debate shouldn't be about whether or not it will happen in the future. The second thing is that when we talk about the rise of the citizen journalism, I think this could be one of two things or both things. First is a huge amount of production of this citizen journalism, which means that there's a lot of material out there that's being published by independent private citizens. And at the same time, it's about consumption, right? Because, of course, it's very difficult to suggest that there is impact, assuming that there is very minimal consumption. So there is an assumption that there is a popularity of consumption of this kind of alternative journalism as opposed to your conventional corporate journalism. The second thing is this part in the info slide, sorry, not that one. Yeah, professional journalists, I guess, and this part as well. I think this clarifies that this also includes individuals who are not necessarily part of a journalism company. And this is important because specifically citizen journalism presumably is about amateurs rather than individual professional journalists. So this debate is probably not just about individuals being able to provide alternative media as compared to conglomerates and stuff. So that's the first thing. Second thing, democratic nations. I think this is also particularly important because it suggests that there is some significant level of freedom of the press. And people generally don't get arrested. Press. Yeah, people generally don't get arrested for very slight versions of dissidents, which means that maybe you can run that this also happens in democratic nations that are a bit more authoritarian, but generally it's a little bit harder for the government to clamp down on anti-government rhetoric. At the same time, I think it also suggests that there is a polarity of opinions available, which means that it's probably not just going to be people who talk about pro-government things, not just pro-government things, but people talking about one particular part of the political and economic spectrum. People are probably going to have a variety of views the same way that you might have it in not regular, but corporate media outlets. Yeah. So that's the first part of, I think, the clarifications for this debate. Next, let's talk about proposition and what proposition can possibly run. Let's talk about setup first. So I think there are a couple of things that can be said under prop, right? The first is, as we pointed out before, that because these are democratic states, there's some level of plurality. We're unlikely to have monolithic opinions. Monolithic opinions. So what I mean by this is just that there is some level of diversity that you can expect, even in your established corporate media outlets. So it's unlikely to be the case that a state only has Fox News type media, and it also probably has people talking about opinions on large outlets from across the spectrum. And the reason for this can be that first, it is likely that you have an oversaturation that happens if everyone talks about the same thing. So because they're private companies, they want to make sure that they capture a part of the market um, that is not oversaturated. So this is why there is a general natural tendency for them to express different kinds of views that appeal to different parts of the population. The second thing I think you can is about characterization. So as we may or may not be familiar with, characterization is something that could be a standalone thing in your setup. Of course, you don't flag it out as characterization. Alternatively, it could be included into your argument. So that's just up to you and how you want to structure your speech to maximize effectiveness. So a couple of things, right? For characterization, I think the first thing that you want to do is just compare traditional journalists to citizen journalists. I think you can suggest a couple of things. The first is that trade journalists all professional journalists are trained to frame information. So trained in framing, as opposed to your amateurs who probably are less formally trained in being able to make sense of large amounts of data information um, in the context of a bigger picture. The second thing is that your trade journalists are enabled not just by a high level of experience in being able to tell apart one-off incidents from indicators of a trend, but they also have resources to gain a wide range of perspectives across different interrelated fields and sectors to form a more complete representation and analysis of events. So there are many reasons for this, such as having a bigger budget and being credible enough as an official source that informants are more willing to talk to you. So let's say you go up to a minister and you say, I want to do an interview for XYZ company, that probably allows you more access and people are more willing to even grant you an interview in the first place, as opposed to like a random person just coming up to a high profile individual and saying, I want to interview you for my Facebook post or something. Like one has a greater appeal than the other. So we can just talk about resources, right? And the ability to see trends. Resources plus trend identification. Oops, identification. And you want to, of course, compare this because, like, with all debates, you don't want to just talk about things in a vacuum, right? You want to show some level of, like, you want to have a baseline so that I understand what the metrics are or what you're comparing it with. So in this case, you want to contrast this with citizen journalists who are often only privy to either anecdotal accounts of events or events that exclusively occur within their respective fields of expertise. So this means that you are not excluding the possibility that these people are perhaps experts in specific fields. We're not just talking about laymen who don't really have any expert knowledge on anything. So this could be an economist, for instance, or someone who's like, I don't know, an expert on global warming, whatever it is, right? You can suggest that as long as they're not professional journalists, they're also within this debate. And I think that just helps to make the debate far more convincing, or not convincing, but at least like more robust, because you're being charitable about the characterization of these individuals. Like they're not stupid or anything, right? These are A, smart individuals, and B, individuals who have expert knowledge or specific knowledge on certain fields. So they know what they're talking about generally. But what do we understand of them? Because they only have a specific field of knowledge and they're not trained in framing and stuff like that, the things that we talked about for professional journalists, this means that they have limited experience and info. Let's just call it info, okay? And at the same time, they have limited resources. So I think it's important whenever you're characterizing individuals as being unable to provide certain kinds of quality products to suggest plausible reasons outside of random, unsupported analysis, such as, oh, they don't know stuff or they are just not smart enough. Because I think first, that's probably untrue. And second, it's just very unconvincing rhetoric. So I think you can suggest that they have limited resources, right? So therefore, there are structural reasons why they just can't produce as good material as your professional journalists. I think the second thing that you want to look at after characterization then is the effect of this myopic reporting. So after you've suggested that like your amateur journalists don't have a lot of access and ability to frame information, I think you can suggest that like myopic, when I say myopic, I mean like, not seeing the bigger picture. Myopic reporting is bad because this equals misinformation equals misinfo. Okay. I think there are a couple of parts to this. The first is that you want to suggest that there is so much more info available that sells contradicting narratives, so fake news is less easily detectable. Plus, at the same time, the standards of what is reliable and credible news become largely abandoned since we don't have to answer to other professionals. Not we, but like your amateur journalists don't have to answer to other professionals. And therefore, for that reason, as well as all the like profit incentive reasons, there is a lack of natural incentives for these people to adhere to credibility and reliability standards, making them bad actors in disseminating information. So there are a couple of premises to this, right? The first part, of course, is no incentive to, let's just call it check and balance. Yeah, check and balance. And at the same time, to lower standards, because like if you're exposed to a certain standard of a thing, it becomes very difficult for you to hold other similar items to a higher standard, even though the trend is not that way, right? So I guess like an example that's very, very tangential, but just because I like using analogies, it's like if all you've ever eaten is bad bread or very subpar bread, then like you're not gonna be it's not going to be difficult to wait, rather you're not going to be disappointed when you get like very slightly better bread that is still super subpar because that's all you've come to expect. And your standards are just generally low because of that trend. So same thing for any other kind of consumption, right? Including the consumption of media or like journalistic pieces. If you have low standards already because people just don't bother checking their work, they don't bother fact checking, they don't have anyone who holds them accountable, then it's very unlikely they're going to develop those standards independently. Next thing then, uh, you want to suggest that there is obviously an impact, right? Which is that bad info leads to bad decision making. So this could be in the democratic context where like you directly just vote for people who are like actually acting against you, or alternatively, it could be other kinds of decision making. For instance, making investment choices, or choosing to move to a particular country, or getting a certain kind of education. Like there are 1,001 things that we decide based on the information that we receive, right? Basically, every decision we make is based on information we receive, not necessarily only from journalistic outlets, but from people that we are surrounded by, pop culture, and I guess journalistic media. So that's the second thing. Third thing, then, I think you can suggest that this rise has directly caused an inability for traditional journalists to correct from misinformation for lots of reasons. So you want to suggest that, like, there are already a lot of problems, right? As you pointed out, because people can't make good decisions, and they don't bother looking for information that is accurate. And then you can suggest that for all the structural reasons, these amateur journalists just don't have the capacity to come up with pieces that are as high in quality or as trustworthy. But at the same time, you can suggest that it is difficult for us to mitigate the effects. Mitigation is hard or unlikely. A couple of things under this. The first is you can suggest that there is a certain kind of format that citizen journalism follows. So you can say that, for instance, it is unlikely that they are long form pieces because, I mean, given that the example that they gave is TikTok, then you can suggest that, it specifically targets consumers who don't have a long attention span or only want to watch small pockets of information or read small pockets of information. So you can suggest that people no longer have a tolerance for the alternative, which is long form pieces, right? And thus they are incapable of going through the thorough analysis that is needed to fully explore an issue. The second thing you can say is that because citizen journalism generally is consistent of, or like by definition is consisting of people who don't depend on it as a source of income, you can suggest that there are obviously not going to be a lot of costs involved to consume this kind of journalism. And the alternative, which is your corporate media, become far less attractive because the paywalls become less worthwhile to accept when you have alternatives. And here you want to just clarify that you're not saying these alternatives are good, but you want to suggest that um, there is an information asymmetry in that people who are consuming this information think that it's good information because that's all they know, right? Because of all the analysis we talked about just now. And of course, if everyone in your social circle is consuming that kind of media, it's unlikely they're going to question its credibility. So you can suggest that people don't bother to pay for paywalls, and this is problematic because your pro journalists need to make a living. Um, and therefore it's difficult for them to sustain producing quality content when you're either A, not paying them enough to be able to get the resources to come up with good material, or B, forcing them to get like a second job in order to supplement their income. I think the third thing is that there is a false equivocation between being unpaid and being genuine. And here there's a lot of analysis that is required to substantiate this claim, obviously, but I'm not going to go into that extensively. I think you can suggest that generally, given the choice between work by citizen journalists and pro journalists, people prefer citizen journalists, and throngs of individuals acting as citizen journalists justify um, populist notions that, as long as you're someone who's not a professional, you're for the common man, and therefore, like, you're very in touch with reality that the elites are not in touch with and stuff. So generally, you want to suggest that there are many, many reasons why people actually actively move away from traditional journalism, specifically because of this rise. So therefore, all the bad things that happen as a result of your misinfo stemming from this citizen journalism is something that you cannot account for, or rather something that you cannot try and reduce the harms of precisely because of this rise. So that's some stuff that proposition can say. Let's move quickly to opposition. I'm just gonna right here, opposition. So I think firstly, opposition can fight the characterization provided by proposition by doing a couple of things, right? The first is you want to break down the dichotomy set up by government or side proposition between pro and citizen journalists. When I say pro, I mean professional. Yep, so first, break dichotomy. And I think this is a good tactic in debates generally because often you'll have an opponent that under-analyzes two different groups of people or under-analyzes groups of people such that it is assumed that there is a huge distinction and that the qualities of these two groups of individuals don't overlap. And I think it's always strategic to try and think about those claims and ask yourself if it's necessary that these particular groups have these distinct qualities. So I think first and foremost, you want to suggest that pro journalists don't hold a monopoly on being discerning, objective gatherers of information, and citizen journalists are perfectly capable of being the same, and so are readers, right? So first, non-pro journalists are discerning, right? So this applies both to the producers of these alternative news pieces, but also the consumers. I think you can suggest that, secondly, um, precisely because these alternative news types appeal to a specific demographic of readers, while some journalists produce centrist articles, some others inherently present partisan views to stay in demand. And the reason why this is relevant is because you want to suggest that any kind of um, any kind of echo chamber that Pop suggests exists in Ops world is likely to be one that is not mutually exclusive. So both sides have echo chambers. Like if you're someone who's super, I don't know, into Fox News type work, then you're probably not going to, out of curiosity or because you want to be open-minded, start straying into the other side's type of rhetoric and exploring that on a rational level. So therefore, this is likely to be the same effect of algorithms determining what kind of content you get on Facebook or TikTok or whatever kind of platform you use. So therefore, both sides have this problem. The third thing you want to suggest is that while pro-journalists may have greater access to field experts and the like, citizen journalists are grassroots-centric, which means that they have more exclusive access to the average person who will talk extensively about who will talk extensively only to someone who's familiar, and therefore you get an on-the-ground understanding of things. So you can suggest that there are exclusive fields where only citizen journalists are able to access those fields. So exclusive access. And here I think you can just use some level of contextualization to suggest that this rise coincides with a disenchantment with the elites as we understand them. So like the reason why populism is on the rise is because there is some truth perhaps to like the feeling that there is some truth to a lot of these larger corporations and institutions just ignoring what the common man cares about. And first, maybe you can directly fight populism by ensuring that people feel as though they are in fact heard by citizen journalists. But second, assuming that there is some legitimacy to these issues that are brought up by populist, opportunist politicians, then you probably have some level of greater information with these citizen journalists. So it's much harder for you to like manipulate arguments that that appeal to populist notions and tendencies. So that's the first thing you can do. I think the second thing you can do is suggest that proposition has to defend one of two alternatives. So second thing, second thing, I think you can just call it burden push. Yeah, so you can suggest that proposition has to suggest that either pro-journalists present a single narrative, and this is bad because there is no such thing as a single objective truth, and a world without alternative independent news sells people either blatant misinformation or incomplete information. So you want to suggest, therefore, that there is a false notion of a single truth. I think we just cross this out to show that there is no such thing, and it's bad for us to sell people this idea because that gives you bad info, and then all the effects that prop talks about or could talk about, right? Which is like bad decisions and stuff. Bad decisions. And when I say bad decisions, I think it's important to clarify that bad decisions doesn't mean making decisions that you personally think are wrong, but just making decisions against your own interests. So for instance, if for some reason you insist upon being a bigot, like that's your identity, then democracy is not about trying to stop you from being that. Like obviously there should be safeguards to protect people who might be victimized by you, especially if you're part of the majority that has like an asymmetry of power. But generally democracy is about being able to actualize your choices based on what you genuinely are interested in, or what you genuinely find to fit your own objectives. So if you're a bigot, then like you don't want to accidentally vote for someone who's, I don't know, gonna criminalize you for bigotry, assuming that that's the most important issue for you. So the idea is that you should be able to represent yourself accurately, and generally, regardless of the value you place on specific votes and decisions, it's just difficult for people to make such accurate representations of themselves through the decisions that they make if the information they're starting off with is bad information. Yeah, so you can suggest that the rise of citizen journalists actually corrects for this incomplete information that leads to unrepresentative decisions. Or alternatively, you can suggest that proposition has to support that pro-journalists present a wide spectrum of views, which requires the reader to actively analyze these views and come to their own understanding of the truth. And this suggests that the same consumers are also capable of applying these same standards to citizen journalism. So remember the stuff about characterizing these alternative news outlets as having the same problem of echo chambers and stuff like that. So assuming that you don't want to buy that echo chambers are a thing, either because like journalism is so diversified and people generally read all sorts of media instead of consuming one type of media only, therefore these problems don't necessarily exist in proposition, then you also have to accept that this reality applies to your citizen journalism, which means therefore that the same consumers who are able to discern between Fox News and The Guardian, like yes, I recognize not same country, but like just bear with me for my examples. Yeah, if you've got people who are able to discern between these two types of media that are very, very different and think like, I think one version is the truth, and we think that these people are not harmed specifically by professional journalism in spite of the disparate types of information they're receiving, then we can suggest that they can apply the same standards of reasoning to citizen journalism, which means they're not as like helpless to misinformation as Prop wants to make them out to be. So can think, not helpless. Yeah. Okay, and the exclusive benefit you can suggest here is that um, you now have a greater pool of information by which to form a more complete and informed picture. Thus, you make better decisions. So this supplements the claim you're making, which is that people are actually much smarter than proposition wants to make you believe. Which means, therefore, that not only will they be able to rationally decide what is true from what is false, um, sorry, not what is true from what is false, but like what is rational from what is not. But they will also be able to use both, be exposed to both like citizen journalism while at the same time wanting to consume traditional journalistic pieces because they are rational individuals. So they know, for instance, that like your Facebook post by your neighbor, for instance, is not going to give you the full picture. So you should use that while also complementing this with the consumption of um not official but professionally created media. I think the third thing that you can suggest then is that you create a culture of proactiveness. Proactiveness. And the reason for this is a couple of things, right? Um, First and foremost, when I say proactiveness, what I mean is that average people feel a responsibility for reporting on as much of their surroundings as possible. And you can claim a couple of things under this. The first is that traditional journalism can't gaslight you into thinking that your interpretation of events is wrong because like they are the only ones who have access to truth. And therefore, if let's say you think differently from them, then you are definitely misinformed. And I think you want to suggest here that first and foremost, given the specific kinds of structures that are probably going to be given by proposition to suggest that there is more access to like official information is actually a problem for professional journalists. So for instance, if your only understanding of a recession comes from like your MPs and stuff, it's very difficult for you to understand first how this recession developed on the ground, and second, how it affects people on a day-to-day basis, because obviously the lived realities of people are very different. So therefore, you can suggest that there is a lack of representation, and it's a problem because people think that given the lack of representation in your professional media, it is likely that their experiences are isolated or that they're actually wrong in their interpretation of things. And that's bad because obviously, like these are real experiences and they ought to be acknowledged as such. So you can suggest, therefore, that you're less likely to be made to belittle your own experiences. The second is that you can, of course, have greater representation of disenfranchised groups whose concerns won't necessarily sell papers. So people who don't make up the majority or people who don't have opinions that are as popular. These kinds of things at least see the light of day. The last thing you can suggest is that you literally save lives. Sorry. So the example that I'm thinking of immediately is the series of Turkey Syria earthquakes, where because of citizen journalism, people were able to do things like give live updates on their location, give developments on the ground. Sorry. And these are the kinds of things that your professional journalists just can't do. I'm sorry. Yeah. So your professional journalists can't do this. Firstly, because of access, right? But second, also because like it is generally a time sensitive thing. I'm so sorry for my voice, by the way. Like I don't know what happened to it. It just did this. Yeah, so you can suggest that like certain things which you need to report on are time sensitive in nature, and the kind of information you can produce would would be the difference between being able to save one more individual over not being able to do that. So therefore, the proactiveness or the culture of proactiveness is good precisely because it makes people report more because it's the new normal. And therefore, you find out about things you otherwise won't find out about and can intervene in a timely fashion. So, yeah, as you can see, there are a couple of major impacts you can suggest happen in opposition's world. Yeah, so that is all for this video. I hope you learned something, and I hope that um this will help you like think about the motion, even if you never debate it again. Just think about the contemporary issues that surround the motion. All right. Thanks for watching.